All right. Well, hey guys, Ricky Howard here with the DoD Contract Academy. And today I'm with Jim Abercrombie. He's the president and founder of Trek10. And Trek10 designs, builds, supports highly scalable cloud-based systems. Jim's going to tell us a lot about what that means. But here's another example of a great company that is selling to the government, selling to the DoD. And I think you're going to learn a lot today from Jim and about his company. And maybe there's something there that you can do with them. So, hey, Jim, welcome to the podcast today.
Hey, Ricky, great to see you.
Yeah, no, good to talk to you again. I know, we had I say this all the time, but we had a great conversation the other day. And it actually, that could have been a podcast in and of itself. I think we talked for over an hour, just about all of the different efforts you guys had and kind of the value you're bringing the government. And it was a really interesting conversation. So I think that, everyone's has a lot to learn from what you can talk about today. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, hey, before we get into Trek10 and what that does, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? Because you had an interesting background before getting into the public sector. And it's the first time I heard something like this. So, and you might even have to explain to me exactly what you were doing there. Because
yeah,
I have like the Wolf of Wall Street in my mind, but maybe that's not quite accurate.
Yeah, that's certainly a vivid picture of Wall Street, right? But I graduated college. I grew up in Indiana. I went to a small liberal arts school. I graduated college in 2002. And after college, moved to Chicago, and I got a job as a bond trader at the Chicago Board of Trade. And so, you mentioned Wolf of Wall Street. You think about, some of the classic shows like Trading Places where, they're in the pits on the floor, everyone's yelling and screaming.
Yeah.
I was in that building, but I was not down on the floor. We actually traded cash treasury bonds, so U.S. government debt, which ironically around 2005, there was such a boom and we actually had budget surpluses that folks in my industry were worried that we were going to be out of business, right? Obviously, financial crisis happened. We've been running deficits for a long time, so that didn't really come to play. But yeah, I was a bond trader for 13 years. And, I really, I was able to use my economics and liberal arts background to really get a keen understanding of what was happening in the world economy and sort of the inputs and outputs of what happened, which is all reflected in prices. And so it was a really fascinating career. It came to kind of a natural conclusion as we were starting up Trek10 and as candidly, the tech advanced so much that, guys like me weren't really traders anymore. It was all math PhDs, running algorithms and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't imagine a better sort of start to a career, as someone that was really interested in kind of how the world worked. And
no, I was going to say that. So while you were there and you were a bond trader and you were talking about U.S. government debt, I would imagine you learned a little bit about how government procurement works or at least how government debt works and funding. Is that accurate or am I off there?
Not as much as you would have thought, right? Like we certainly, geopolitical events mattered because U.S. interest rates are the benchmark interest rates for the world. Right. And everything from U.S. economic information to geopolitical challenges. Like I remember I wasn't trading in 9/11. I started in 2002, but there were a number of scares that happened in the early years. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time it came out over the wire that a envelope with white powder was opened at the Capitol, and it got right. That moves the market tremendously. Sure. The second time it happens, it moves a little bit. By the time the third time it happens, everyone just sort of yawns and moves on. Right? Markets react heavily to new information, and they tend to discount what they've learned. So I didn't learn as much about procurement. I did gain a little bit more of an appreciation just for the size and scope of the government, right? As a youth or a college student, I don't think that's something you ever spend any time thinking about. Right. But just the absolute numbers and the reach of the U.S. government became a little bit apparent there. But I just want to be clear. There was no point in that career where I said, man, when I'm done with this, I really want to go sell to the government. Like that it was totally, when we look back on our lives, it seems like there's this path that's mapped out. But, going forward, it was just, it was as random as you could get.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. I think that seems true for a lot of folks, certainly for me as well, about, just the random events happening and kind of, easy to look back versus look forward and say, here's the path, here's the plan. So tell me a little bit about Trek10, because I think I heard you say that, as your career was dying down, Trek10 was scaling up. So what was your idea for Trek10, before you actually started the business, and what did it kind of become?
Yeah, great question. So I've got to give all credit to one of my co-founders, Shane. He actually ran a data center in South Bend, and he landed AWS, that's Amazon Web Services, so that's a cloud provider we work with, as a customer in 2011. And it was one of the early footprints in the Midwest. And Shane was running this data center. He had a lot of big, universities and Fortune 500 companies as customers. And he kept saying, man, this AWS group, they do it different than anyone else, right? And he's a curious guy, so he dug in, he understood why, and he started to learn about this global network of, assets, basically cables, fiber cables, and data centers that they were building. And it was an approach that, and a scale that, really no one had ever done before. Mm-hmm. And so, Shane being interested in that, really dug in, made some contacts at AWS to learn about their plans. And I don't know if I mentioned this at the top, but we're in South Bend, Indiana. He ran into someone else who turned into the third co-founder in South Bend, who was an early practitioner on AWS. This other guy, Andy, had moved some of the business he was running to the cloud in the late 2000s, and he actually became one of the first 1,000 people in the world to get an AWS professional certification. So he was a very early practitioner. What I brought to the table really was some of my market acumen, and I felt like I was good at identifying trends. And so I did my research. I candidly didn't know too much about the cloud and what it was, or certainly what it would become. But I came across this case study with a company called Viscase. And Viscase was the world's largest maker of sausage casings, right? So think of like hot dogs, bratwurst, whatever. Right. Appropriately, they were based in Germany, but had a big outfit in Chicago. Two things you think about, in that industry. And the case study said, hey, Viscase is moving their SAP back up to AWS. And I read that and I thought to myself, if the sausage casing manufacturing company is a customer of the cloud, there's not a business in the world that this isn't appropriate for.
So,
right?
So just before you go on, so the infrastructure that you were talking about, so you were talking about Shane kind of ran that data center, and then AWS, they were talking about, all of the fiber networks and the different repositories that they were building out. This was the infrastructure for the cloud, as we call the cloud now. That's
correct?
Okay. You want to? I'm sure most of my listeners at this point understand cloud, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what it is and why that was different than the way we would maybe store data before.
Absolutely. So if we go back, the very early sort of servers were based in companies' data rooms, right? I'm sure we've seen pictures of these massive IBM machines from the 50s, computers that took up, rooms 2 or 3 times the size of the conference room I'm sitting in right now.
Sure.
And those got condensed to, companies that built these servers that could do pretty intensive processing and compute. Well, these servers were pretty expensive, right? On the order of $50,000 to $100,000. They had a really long lead time. So if you wanted to, say, start a business that required that, you need upfront capital and you'd need several months to order them. Then you need to install and configure them. Excuse me. What the cloud did, what data centers did is they said, or co-location facilities is a term often used. They said, hey, you don't want to run this in some closet in your office building. We'll have a facility that all we do is run servers and you can rent from us. And what data centers sell is space, power, and connectivity, right? They sell the basically always on ability of these compute and storage resources.
Right.
And as you can imagine, think about them. Maybe a good analogy would be thinking about all the retail mom and pop stores that existed, and then think about Walmart. And they came along and they said, we're going to do everything you did, but we're going to do a lot more, and we're going to do it on a bigger scale, and we're going to do it a lot cheaper. Right. And so what the cloud is today is on-demand access to that storage and compute, right? And ultimately, the cloud is a commodity, similar to how you buy your power from a commodity provider like electricity.
Sure.
What's interesting about electricity isn't that it's, it isn't necessarily, what's interesting is the idea that it's ubiquitous, that you can plug something into any outlet anywhere and you're going to get constant power. And only once that is true can you create things like the radio or the hairdryer or the television, right? They need that baseline infrastructure to build on top of. What we think is super interesting about the cloud was that when you have this baseline storage, network, and compute, you then have the ability to build these really interesting things on top of them. And so any digital business you see today, whether it's a Netflix or whether it's maybe not quite a digital business, but think of an app where you can buy cars, that ultimately is becoming a digital business. That could not be possible with the cloud. And so that's kind of what the cloud is.
Okay, interesting. So you identified this kind of early on, it sounds like. So talk about the progression here. So how does Trek10 play into kind of this new technology or the new way we're dealing with data?
Yeah, so we started the business in 2013. Cloud was in its infancy. I think AWS, they have an annual conference. It's actually the week after Thanksgiving. So it's coming up here. And the very first one, there were maybe 1,500 people at, and the second one it was 3,000. And by the time we started going, maybe it was in the 4,000 range. I think the last year before COVID, they had between 50 and 60,000 attendees to that. So if attendees for the conference, you can also look at AWS revenue, which they've broken out for many years, and see how that's grown. But, we were in the relatively early days. But like I said, looking at the trend, looking at the idea that every business in the world was going to be a customer, we knew there was going to be a long runway to go. Located here in the Midwest, we said to ourselves, candidly, it might be a few years before a lot of folks in our region are wanting to tap the cloud. But the one thing we do know is that you're not going to go to the person that runs your data center or your IT environment today and say, hey, we need you to build us a cloud environment. They're just different skill sets. Right. It's similar to in the advent of the automobile, those early buyers of automobiles weren't going to the person who managed their horses to take care of their new automobile. Even though it's still transportation, still getting you to the same place, it's a different skill set. So we saw this emerging need for cloud specific skill sets in order to help businesses leverage what really is we've seen customers get 5, 10, 15x benefit by moving to the cloud instead of a data center. And that's a combination of cost savings or performance improvement. And you don't get those kinds of gains without some specialization in order to help you get there.
Okay, awesome. So you identified a need there with Trek10. And so your initial push or your initial customer base, from what I understand, was commercial, right? So commercial companies building some momentum there. We don't have to get too far into that, but except to say, it sounds like you guys are really successful, with the services that you provided in your commercial customers. Could we talk a little bit about, how did that pivot to the government? Like, what were some of your first interactions with the government? What made you start thinking about it? And how did you get into public sector sales?
Yeah, great question. And I'll tell you the first story about how we tried and failed, and then come back a couple of years later and how we found some success. So around 2016, there was an individual here locally that moved to town from DC. He's an attorney and he had done a bunch of BD, federal BD. And he really, we became friends, and he really laid out the argument of why we should be looking to sell into the government, right? And it's what we hear on your podcast all the time, right? All the benefits from doing it. But this was 2016. And when you looked at RFIs, they didn't use the word cloud. They used hybrid IT infrastructure. And they certainly didn't call out AWS or, Microsoft Azure, which are the two big players today. And as we got into it, gosh, there's a whole lot of compliance and paperwork and all sorts of things that need to be true for you to even consider going after a government contract. And frankly, where we were as a company, we were probably 15 people or so. I personally spent a lot of time on it, really trying to figure out a way in, and basically realized that, hey, it's not the appropriate time for us to do this. Fast forward a couple years, we had worked with a couple large enterprises. We had built, really a strong reputation inside the AWS partner ecosystem as a company that could deliver on these kind of really scalable and complex technical challenges.
Right.
And that's all well and good. But what really happened is 2018, as you know, is that's when AppWorks started. Right. And AppWorks, which I assume your listener base is very familiar with, but if they're not, AppWorks took a program that had been around for 40 plus years, the Small Business Innovative Research Program, and its partner, STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer. It took that and it said, hey, this program traditionally has put out a lot of very specific topics that if you were being candid about it, there really just weren't that many groups across the country that were well equipped to respond to those. Not because of the overhead burden, but because of the specificity of the topics, right? We could be talking something like, for a plane at a certain altitude and a certain speed, the light refracts in a certain way. And what we're looking for is to add something to that so that,
right,
it protects pilots' eyes, right? Something that hyper specific, like think about the labs that have to be working on, refractory technology plus, gas or glass or composite materials, or just the Venn diagram of folks that can respond intelligently to something like that was really small. Yeah. What AppWorks did in my synopsis is it turned the entire process on its head. It's instead of saying, here's these very specific items, like we're going to come after like a sniper to try to find someone to get, we're going to open the aperture and say, hey, if you are a successful commercial company, and how do they define success? You actually had to have commercial sales that you could prove, right? So there's businesses out there that are paying to buy your product. So if you meet that criteria and what you sell is something you think the Air Force could benefit from, tell us about it. And by the way, here's how we want you to tell us about it. Put together a 15-page slide deck, right? Put together a 5-page paper. This wasn't the New York phone book style documents to go in.
Yep.
This was a lightweight way to get in the door. And we were part of the second cohort, I think 18.3, which was 2018 and the third cycle for that year. So it was around the end of fiscal 2018. Mm-hmm. And we were successful. And our first technology we put in was a data ingestion engine. And we took work we had done with a couple key commercial customers to really ingest and rapidly process data for business purposes. Mm-hmm. And the example of the enterprise we worked with that we really, learned this, they did a lot of automobile sales. And whenever you buy a car, imagine you go to a website, you've got 50, 60, 70 images, right, of that vehicle. Well, this company processed over 500,000 vehicles a month. Multiply that by 50 to 70 images, and you think about the high volume. They were running all of that stuff in a data center. They were running out of storage room. They were adding hundreds of thousands of dollars of storage arrays every month, and came to us through AWS and said, hey, there's got to be a cloud-based solution. We put together something. It was very successful for their business. And, we did similar projects for a couple different customers, but the overlying theme was this high-speed data ingestion and processing. So that's what we put our proposal in for AppWorks. And they said, sounds great, you're in, right? And we're like, okay, cool. Us and 60, 70 other companies were in. Well, we kind of learned together, right? They put us in a cohort. They had weekly calls where we learned about finding customers. Mm-hmm. And the big charge with an AppWorks phase 1 is to go find a customer, right? It's all about, that contract in itself isn't that notable, except it's that license to hunt, as they say.
Right.
And so we worked with a partner that we had developed that was also, pushing people into the government space. Mm-hmm. And we ended up working with a simulation agency across the Air Force. And so we found them, we took our tech, we adapted it to what they were doing. And really, ever since then, we've done a number of other projects, but we're still working on the simulation ecosystem and still bringing kind of innovations, moving these things to the cloud. But yeah, that was the first kind of story of how we got in.
Interesting. So for those listening, typically just to go through kind of the SBIR process from a 100,000 foot view, right? So the SBIR and TTR process, for the most part, looks like you have phases. You have a phase 1, you typically have a phase 2, and then you potentially have a follow on from that phase 2, depending on what you're doing. And then that phase 1 that you're talking about, you're on contract with the government and you're getting paid, but it's usually, in the big scheme of things, it's not a lot. It's usually somewhere between 50 and 150 grand. It can be less, it can be a little bit more, but you might owe, and I don't know what you owed at the end, but you might owe something like a feasibility study at the end of that. But you're right. The real reason you're on contract there is, the team thought that, hey, your solution has some merit, and what we want to do now is see, is there a fit in the government somewhere? And depending on who you did this with the Air Force, so they probably want you to focus on the Air Force. But is there a fit in the Air Force for your solution? and kind of, especially for companies that have never done this before or don't have government relationships or understand like where the inner workings are, they might help make introductions, or they might, kind of educate you on like, hey, where do you want to go? But that next piece is the reason they're making those introductions is your whole goal is you want to get to a phase 2. And a phase 2 is that's where there's a little bit more money, right? So if it's usually it's either developing your solution or potentially modifying something that already exists for a government purpose. And those, I think the limit's around $1.3 million right now. I thought that was around there, the last one I saw.
Yeah, they've typically ranged from 750 to 1.5 million, depending on the proposal cycle. I think there's some statutory limits that are slightly above that what could be put on a contract. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's generally the range, right? So if you think about 3 months and basically enough money to do some trips and business development to 12 to 24 months and enough money to do a substantial project, right? Like adaptation. Cybers are all about adapting this technology to defense needs, right? So, the Air Force certainly didn't need the exact technology we developed to serve up these images, right? But did they need something highly similar to that in order to make the simulations operate better? Yes, they did. And so our project was about adapting that to their specific needs.
Okay, interesting. So, and then you get, just to be even more specific, you're typically going to a phase 2, and you say get a customer. Usually what you're looking to do is get a MO, we call it an MOU for just going to the city, but a memorandum of understanding. And this is what's interesting. This is why the cyber process is so different from the rest of the acquisitions processes in the government. Because typically in the government, and this is for our listeners, I realize you understand that, but typically you've got most people in the government can never make a purchase. I mean, they could buy office supplies and stuff like that, like the office level, but for any purchase that usually over $10,000 or so. I mean, now you're talking about an acquisitions team putting you on contract, and which is what I did while I was in the Air Force, at least the last half of my career. So that's a very small percentage of people in the government, right? But, and this is what companies mistakenly do, in the beginning, often they'll go to like the user, right? They'll find, hey, I developed something that can help maintainers on aircraft, or I developed, something that can help, the Army guys shoot better during weapons training, whatever it is. A lot of times they'll go to the user, and then they realize, oh, they can't actually make any purchases from me. Because they're not in control of the funding, and they're not contracting officers. So we need to find someone. But with the cyber program, it changes everything, and this is why SBIR is an amazing opportunity, is because you now can go to the user. You don't have to go to an acquisitions unit. You can go to whoever's in your case. I'm not sure who you went to, but you could go to the maintainer in that case and maybe have their ops group commander sign an MOU. All they need to do is think it's a good idea, because it's usually not their money. It's usually the cyber staff work. So if it's not their money, and they don't have to go through the effort of putting you on contract, because usually the cyber office does that, and in this case, AFWorks, it's much easier for somebody to say, hey, if they like your solution, that's a great solution. All they have to do is sign the memo, which all they have to do, that could still be a significant amount of work, right? You need to know what you're doing there. Yeah. But so I guess the bottom line is you went out and you got this MOU signed by a customer or by a unit. What was that process like?
Yeah. So before I get into that detail, I think what you're describing, the classic sales process, right? You need pain, you need budget, and you need decision-making authority, right? And so in the example you gave about, helping shoot on the range or whatnot, that user may have pain, right? And that's great, but without the other two, and by the way, in the corporate world, often the same person or, a small number of two people might have all three of those things.
Sure.
In the government world, they could have pain, they could even have budget, but if they don't have authority, that's what comes from, what you used to do, right? That's the contracting officers. And if you don't have that pathway, it doesn't matter at all if someone has money, if they like what you have, if they want to buy from you, there has to be a vehicle. So what Cyber does is, first of all, they don't need the budget because the small business office is paying for it. And second of all, it handles that kind of authority to do it.
Right.
And so that's why it removes, I think, so much of the friction, right? You're just looking for that pain there. What our process looked like, I told you we were working with a business development partner And they introduced us to a number of customers, right? We went through our own discovery. AFWorks sets up cohorts. There's a lot of help from a lot of the other companies in the cohort. We were all kind of learning together, sharing contacts. There was a matchmaking component where AFWorks would give like de-identified problem statements. And if you selected it and say, hey, I think my thing can, address problem statement 37, they would reach out to the owner of the problem statement. If they wanted an intro, they would then make that happen. I think that's been a little harder for them to do as the program's gotten so much larger than it was in the early days. But yeah, basically anything we can do, right? If you listen to some of the other podcasts, people just talk about kind of turning over every rock there is, because you have this limited window, and you know that at the end of the window, if you can find that customer, you have this opportunity. I mean, our first deal was $750K. That was a huge deal for the size of company we were then, right? And so, we put a lot of effort into finding that. We found this customer with the Air Force Simulations Office. We saw eye to eye. They signed the MOU, which again, it's not just signing a document. There is, they basically commit to work with you, and there is a whole list of information they need to fill in. It's not overly onerous, but security officers, reporting structure, it has to be there, because what AFWorks wants to see is this just someone at the last minute that signed it because someone promised them they might get some money? Or is this someone who actually believes this is a solution that could translate into an operational capability they want to field, which would come under a cyber phase 3, which you alluded to.
Right. And I mean, not only that, now the cyber field has gotten a little bit more competitive. And they really take a strong look at that MOU to see who's signing it, what the use case is, how closely does it match, what they're trying to go after. And you're right. So every cyber phase 2 is a little bit different, but you're right. Typically they are committing to, maybe it's a demonstration on the base. Maybe it's, a modification where they're going to work with, their team to figure out, what the nuts and bolts of that are going to look like. And so interesting. So you've done that. Now you've been pretty successful in the SBIR process. So why don't you walk me through, what happened after that process? What were some of the positives and negatives that you experienced?
Just to be clear, after what process?
After that cyber phase 2, you won the cyber phase 2, and you went through probably adapting to government need there. Did that go well? And what were the next steps after that? Like, what was your assessment of the whole process?
Yeah, I would say we thought it went really well, and we thought we were going to be moving on to a cyber phase 3 kind of immediately afterwards. And that just didn't end up being the case, right? For a number of reasons that I won't get into. It just wasn't appropriate for that customer at that time, which came as a surprise to us. Looking back, it's not a surprise. There were some telltale signs that I think we could see now with a little more experience. Right. But what we did, as someone that was in the markets, there was a saying that I loved that people used to say, like, we're in the business of doing more of what's working and less of what's not, right? And so the what's not was that first foray in 2016 for us trying to crack into the government. Once we realized this worked, we took a real hard look at our business and said, hey, we actually do a lot of different things here. And we're going to systematically go through and evaluate those for their appropriateness for this program. And so we won our second phase 1 in the very next cycle in 19.1 with our cloud support operations. We call it Cloud Ops. And that's actually been our most successful one to date. We hooked up with an Air Force software factory early in the process, and won our second phase 2 in August of 2019. And we've parlayed that into multiple follow-on contracts, most currently an SBIR phase 3, which we're under. And so I'm sure you'll get into the difference between phase 2s and phase 3s. But, to go back to that question, I think it was really important. A key learning is that as we're executing on the contract for the second one, those conversations about we're building this in service of something larger, right? And, what's our plan for what might come next if this is successful? And just having those conversations versus sort of being led by the process the first time we did it.
No, I think, that's extremely important, because there's a lot of assumption about what the government knows, what the military knows, and what they don't know. And I think a lot of people are probably surprised to find out how few people actually do understand the entire process on the government side. And are they even planning on taking your solution to the next slide? Because it's very common, especially in the military. I mean, guys are moving every couple of years, right? So there might be an assumption that someone's going to take that ball and run with it, or they're just not even thinking about it because they have their own efforts that they're working on. So,
and there might be competition that's in place that you're not aware of, right? Like a lot of what we do is net new. A lot of what we build for our commercial customers and that we've done with the Air Force so far has been net new stuff. So with net new, there's just not the entrenched competition that's there. But we've definitely run into situations where we thought we were in a lane that, was pretty good. And then as we've gone down the line, we realized, hey, there's a couple long-term players here that are in it. And if this thing is going to get any bigger, like it's going to get on their radar, and candidly, they probably have a much better chance of winning that deal or that relationship than we do. So taking a real hard look at, is your tech, is your solution something that's net new, or is it something that is trying to displace an incumbent, which we need, right? We need that across the DoD. There's a lot of tech that needs to be displaced. It's just a harder fight, right? It's more of an uphill slog when you're doing that.
No, much harder. Can I pause for one moment?
Absolutely.
Thanks. Hey, how's it going? You there? Sorry about that.
No worries.
Oh, I can't hear you. No, I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Is this better? Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Let me see here. How far along are we? 2:44. Okay, great. No, sorry for the pause there. So we were just talking about, having your technology, having a plan when you are in that phase 2 area, kind of knowing if there's an incumbent on the other side that you're trying to displace, because that could be a huge process, right? And you could have an amazing solution, by the way, and not be able to displace them, right? Because there are a lot of factors at play with trying to do something like that. But right now you are on a phase 3, as you mentioned. So, I think it would be better for everyone to hear from your point of view. Hey, what did that look like? What does that mean from a business point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a couple different important things between, a SBIR phase 3 and the other parts of the SBIR program. The first and most glaring is that SBIR phase 3, the money comes from the customer. So phase 1 and phase 2 comes from the Air Force Small Business Office. Yep. Phase 3, the customer needs to put their money where their mouth is or where their desires are, right? And so that's where we get back to that classic. That's when you do have to, qualify for budget, right? Someone could want what you have all day long, but if they don't have the funds to pay for it, probably not going to happen. The other thing that's really interesting about phase 3s is that statutorily, it's a tech, it needs to derive, extend, or logically conclude from your phase 1 or phase 2 technology. But contractually, it is a sole source, non-contestable, uncapped vehicle, right? So, one thing that we found being part of the early cohorts is that there just weren't a lot of folks across the Air Force that were familiar with the SBIR program. Mm-hmm. Even folks that had been, acquisitions officers had been in various roles for many years. It just, it was kind of in its own little corner. And so there was a big knowledge gap. And AFWERX has done a tremendous job, both for the commercial world, but also for government employees, and really, providing a lot of resources to understand what this is. Because you can imagine, someone calls you up, hey, I've got this cool thing. Yeah, great. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to pay for it. I just need you to sign this letter and we can, wait, what are you talking about? Is this legal? We got that question all the time, right? Like, I'm not sure this is legal. I'm not. So people, rightly so, want to stay on the right side of the law, but getting that education over the last couple of years, I think has been really helpful. The phase 3, the one we did, it was with the customer's contracting shop. So I know they shared, they had gone through a learning curve when they started setting up phase threes. They kind of learned the power of them. Yep. And, really liked that as a vehicle. But for us, it was all about continuing the momentum that had started, right? And we were with one of the software factories, so it was an ecosystem. And we weren't the only company to get phase threes. I think there were 5 different companies that were working on different parts of the stack for the software factory. And all 5 of them were awarded phase three. So we kind of grew together. So it definitely was an advantage of we weren't all out on our own. We were learning with other partners, with other like-minded companies, and with a really progressive customer that was looking to build on the momentum that they had put together through the SBIR phase 2 process.
I gotcha. Okay, interesting. So yeah, SBIR phase 3, that's an interesting, that is another hard challenge. I guess each of the phases present their own challenge to the business and to the government, right? And one thing, I guess, just for anyone listening to this, if you're in a phase 2 or you're graduated from a phase 2, one thing that you mentioned, which I know is true, is that even contracting officers often don't understand that a SBIR phase 2 graduate, that gives certain capabilities to put somebody on contract very quickly that you wouldn't normally have. So that's something that, and by the, you can get somebody to write something up for you. And we've actually done that for some of our clients, which is, hey, just hand this to the contracting officer, and this is step by step with the law, like exactly what they can do. Because one of your goals is always, how can I make it easy for the government to put me on contract? And I'll point out for the listeners, one thing that you haven't really talked about is, maybe aside from, putting the application or the proposal in to get into the SBIR program itself, when you got into the phase 3, I'm assuming you didn't have a huge competition where you were battling it out with, 200 other people. You were a graduate of the phase 2. You had your, you had that, and then you had a customer already aligned. And you said to use their contracting shop. So I'm assuming what they did is they used you through the SBIR process. They were able to bring you to the next contract.
That's right. Yeah. So phase 3. So SBIR phase 1 and or phase 2, whichever way you enter, because there is the concept of a direct to phase 2, right? We follow the phase 1, then phase 2, then phase 3 route. But those are fair and open, and those satisfy the competition requirement. So SBIR phase 3s are sole source and direct awards, right? So once you're there. That's why people call it kind of the holy grail, right? Once you're there, you have the ability, if the customer wants you, legally and statutorily have the ability to set up these contracts. And really, that's just all about, during the early process, proving that you can deliver on what you say you're going to do, right? Like so many things in life, it's, do what you say you're going to do, and good things tend to happen. But this is where, even when you're thinking about that phase 2 signer, right? I mean, I know for us, we used to joke, who's your ideal customer when you start a business? Well, anyone that wants to give you revenue, right? Anyone that wants to pay you to do something. For our first phase 2, it was like, oh, hey, someone's interested in signing it. Great. I think we had 2 parties, and we ended up going with one that we thought had the better, more mature prospects. But for someone that's on their first phase 1 and they're looking for a phase 2, you're really going to be excited when someone says, yeah, I want to work with you. I want to sign that MOU.
Absolutely.
Right? But I think it's worth, as long as you have the time, I think it's worth taking a step back and saying, hey, is this the kind of customer that really has the ability to move on to a next phase if we're done? There is a lot more competition these days. A lot of customers are more aware of this. On the dark side of things, there are some folks probably that just use these repeatedly as ways of getting their, checklist done with no intention of moving on to the next phase. So as a small business owner or leader, you owe it to yourself and your company to do your best to kind of qualify to say, hey, is this an opportunity or is this a good opportunity? Right. Sure. Because they're all not created equal.
No, they're not. And then, we could probably talk about this for the next 2 hours, but, if you did find yourself in the phase 2 SBIR realm and your customer didn't have the funds to take it to a next place, there's certainly ways of finding funding from other agencies, other offices, that could potentially go into that, or finding another somebody to use your SBIR phase 2 graduate status with, that might be something similar.
That's a really interesting point, right? So, Trek10 across our different SBIR contracts, 15 years down the line, assuming we're still a small business, we could all our servers have been with the Air Force. Some Navy customer could say, hey, this thing about the simulation, somehow we found out about this and we want to engage you to do this work. Our phase two our phase two satisfies all the requirements. They could on a phase three, years from now to do something that derives, extends, or concludes from that, right? So, you keep momentum going when you go right from phase two to the next phase relatively quickly. But just because the customer you had didn't work out doesn't mean the door is closed, right? Like you definitely have the ability forever, as long as your company owns that tech and that contract rights, to continue to set up or potentially set up phase threes with other customers. So the BD can continue, after the phase two expires.
No, absolutely. It's a great way to get your foot in the door and, start making connections. And it does. It's kind of like having a contract vehicle or even, a set aside that, allows for some sole source contracting work. It gives the government another means to put you on contract that could potentially be a little easier. And, every office is different. Some offices would be open to it and some wouldn't. But, just having that, I think, is extremely valuable. Okay, so you've done a lot. We've talked a ton about SBIR and kind of your pathway here. Where are you guys at right now and what's next for you as far as government work is concerned? And then I have a couple follow-on questions.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a couple good opportunities we're working on, right? One is with that simulators group I mentioned. There's some interest in taking some of what we've done, which is really move a training simulation to the cloud, moving it up to the classified side. So we're in the works with a group to get a contract stood up to do, to really take this to scale so it can go out into the field and can go to the high side. So we're really excited about that. We have a number of folks on our staff that do have clearances, former military. I don't have that background. I don't have a clearance as of today. Right. So we're learning a lot as we go through that process. Yep. But candidly, there's a lot there, but it's also exciting, right? Like that's kind of an exciting position to be in. Yeah. The other thing that we're really focused on is, when we started Trek10, we thought this was going to be a 10, maybe 15, 20 year movement to the cloud. We think it's going to be a 50-year movement at this point, right? Like if it really started almost 12, 13 years ago, like cloud, we think it's got decades to go, right? I mean, we're seeing major, large enterprises, household names that are just within the last 12 months making big commitments to move to the cloud. I talked to the third largest customer at AWS. This was several years ago, and pre-COVID, an event in New York. They were one of the top 5 biggest customers that Amazon had, and they were always laid out as the spotlight customer that's doing everything right and cloud native and whatnot. Right. And I talked to their head of containers and DevOps, and he said, I think at best we're 3 years into a 7-year journey to get fully automated. And I thought to myself, like, that's like, I don't even have a good analogy for it. It blew my mind to think about how far ahead they are and how much they still had to go to get to where they felt like was real, to harness the full capabilities. And that tells me that, there is just such a long tail. If you look at, obviously the Joint Warfighting Cloud now is a successor to, some of these other contracts that have been under major protest. But across the individual services, Air Force is moving to Cloud One. Army has the ECMA, cloud modernization, contract that's coming. Yep. There's been some movement, but I think we're talking about single-digit percentages of applications that have moved to the cloud across the DoD so far. Yeah. So we really feel like calendar year 23 and 24 are the years where a lot of big moves are going to start happening. And we feel like as a company, because we've been working with some of these clouds I mentioned before, because we've built a lot of tools and processes to help government customers, but to also help like SIBR type small businesses that need to deliver to the government and need to do it in the cloud. We've built those chops, and we think the next 2 years we're really bullish on the opportunity set. So, when we've kind of constructed this government practice, it was kind of like a dog chasing squirrels, right? Oh, there's an opportunity. Oh no, there's an opportunity. Someone's, right. Like I said, who's the best customer? It's someone that's willing to engage with you, right? What we've realized is that got us to where we are today. But the way we're going to get to our next phase of growth is with focus. So we're really, really focusing on those two areas and pouring a lot of resources into, developing those as much as we can. Because like I said in the very beginning about the sausage example, whole world's moving to the cloud. They're going to need expertise and guidance in getting there. And that's kind of the role we are seeing ourselves play over the next several years.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've got a ton of work ahead of you, I know. And, in the government is usually lagging behind industry anyway, right? So when you think about, I mean, we were just talking a little bit about the high side and security clearances and everything. There was hesitancy for the government to go, even when I was in until 2019. And so, talking about the cloud, I think we knew that we needed to get there. But if you look at the mountain of cybersecurity requirements that the government imposes on just our, on-premise networks, right, to make sure to just connect to that, to put a software suite on it, to do whatever. Now looking at the cloud, right, and how do we ensure that the requirements are on there and everything? And we don't need to have that conversation now, but it's taken a long way for the government to start, putting things into the cloud, right? And they are, the Department of Defense is, and there's a lot of different efforts where they're using the cloud. There's government cloud services, and there's Cloud One, and there's a bunch of things going on that the different services are working on. So I feel like we're just getting started seeing what's going to happen there with the cloud. We're coming towards the end of our time here. Maybe we could kind of close this out by giving us your thoughts on, pluses and minuses for your business, working with the government, selling to the government, and advice that you'd give on a business that maybe has just started the process or is struggling a little bit. What would you tell them about, hey, focusing on government sales, balancing that with commercial work? What would you say?
Yeah. So as far as working with the government, personally, I've really enjoyed it. Actually, it was our CEO that kind of pushed me in this direction to say, hey, I think, we have some critical mass here. I think you should be the one to take it and scale it. And I think it suits my personality really well. I'd rather work with a couple of customers and get really in depth with them than work with, a couple dozen or scores of them kind of on the other side. I like the fact that our teams are organized around these like larger, longer projects because they really can work as a unit. And I think we can develop a lot of really good results for the customers doing it that way. So I personally really like it. It definitely comes with headaches that are different, but there's also a lot of positives, right? Like, are we in a recession right now? Maybe, maybe not. We've seen our big commercial customers actually lean in more, but we've seen some of the smaller ones, especially, those exposed to some of the high flying spaces, pull back a little bit. Right. But, the government's going all in, right? They're jumping in with both feet. Whether there's a recession in 23 or not, they're still moving a whole bunch of stuff to the cloud, right? Absolutely. So the counter cyclicality of it is, I think, good just from like a business leadership perspective. But the advice I would give folks today is that it is a little bit of a different landscape, right? So the bar to get in is much lower than it was pre-AFWERX. And not only that, AFWERX was the leader. There was a recent announcement that I think across the DoD, all of the services need to have an open topic, at least once a year, right? So open topic was what I described earlier, where if you have a tech that people tell us about it kind of thing. They're all going to take their own little different spin on it, right? I think the Navy probably is going to bring in less companies, but have put a lot more effort in making sure that the ones that do get in are, do have a clear path to those phase twos. Mm-hmm. But it's a great channel. Innovation and government are words that usually, don't go in the same sentence. And it really does feel like that has changed in the last couple of years. So if someone's getting into it, if they're considering it, I'd say try it. If you're in the process, I'd say, get excited about that first MOU signer, but, qualify them. And I would say there are a lot of companies out there that have gone through this. There's probably 3,000 to 4,000 at this point that have won at least a phase one through AFWERX. And every cohort, I know in the early cohorts, we would always start Slack rooms and invite people and collaborate. So many people are in the position of, hey, we do something different. We're trying to figure this out together. It's a great wide government, right? It's like we say we sell to the Air Force, right? That's like saying we sell to, I don't know, Massachusetts or something. It's so big. It really is. Not like because I'm getting something, it's not hurting you and vice versa, right? It's like we can all win together. And I think that the state of a lot of companies that have worked with the government for a long time, I mean, let's be candid, they aren't always on the cutting edge of technology. So
Right.
if you really do something that your customers value that you think can make a difference, I think it's worth really leaning in to explore that to its fullest extent.
Yep. No, well said. How can people contact you? What if they want to, work with Trek10 or reach you personally? What would you give them for contact information?
Yeah, I'd say head to the website, trek10.com. We've got a great blog for those more technically minded. It's one of the top 10 AWS blogs in the ecosystem that gets really into details. But you can have contact info there, info at trek10.com, and some phone numbers. If you do want to reach out, reference this podcast and it'll get routed to me directly. Or if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn, you can find me there, Jim Abercrombie on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to get a hold of. And again, get lots of random reach outs. So if someone wants the message, reference the podcast, and I'll put that one at the top of the response list.
Roger that. Well, hey, thanks, Jim. Jim Abercrombie, founder, president of Trek10. Thank you for coming on the podcast. This has been great.
All right. Thank you, sir. I've enjoyed it.
All right. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Head over to dodcontract.com if you're looking for any help selling to the government. We have some free training there and a couple programs about to come out. And other than that, we will see you next time.